urgent! It's hell at the front. Russians are panicking, evacuating their own. And logistics, already hanging by a thread, have gone off a cliff. Minsk has given Putin a massive kick. Lukashenko is distancing himself from the Kremlin's war. Peace to the world. It's not me and it's not my problem. Panic in Russia. Moscow is bristling with air defenses. What are the Russians protecting so fiercely, and why are they preparing for the worst? And Ukraine's partners are entering the game with massive support. This weapon will change everything. Moscow, get ready. In the Kremlin, everything is spiraling out of control. We'll talk about that right now. Greetings! This is Ukraine Today. I'm Maria Farafonova with the latest events. In the south, a real nightmare is beginning for the occupiers. What the Kremlin called a reliable rear is falling apart right before our eyes. Logistics are crumbling, key routes are under threat, and the word evacuation is heard louder where just yesterday they dreamed of a new offensive. The Russian command is frantically patching holes and trying to save a situation that is increasingly spiraling out of control. What's happening in the south? Why could this become a major problem for the occupiers? Watch the report. In the south, very unpleasant times are beginning for the Russian army. While Kremlin propaganda continues to talk about a stable front and more fantastic successes, reality is increasingly forcing the occupiers to pack up and look for retreat routes. Ukrainian forces are methodically knocking out Russian logistics, leaving enemy garrisons without supplies. And where threats of an offensive were heard just yesterday, today they are already discussing evacuation. It seems a new phase of a gesture of goodwill has begun for the Russian military on the Crimean spit. After months of loud claims about controlling the coast, the occupiers have suddenly faced a harsh reality. Without food, water, fuel, and ammunition, even the loudest propaganda doesn't help much. Ukrainian drones have methodically turned Russian logistics into a survival game, where every attempt to deliver cargo increasingly ends in a one-way trip. According to the Ukrainian military, supplies to the Crimean spit are almost paralyzed. What the Kremlin recently called a reliable bridgehead increasingly resembles a cut-off patch of land from which personnel must be hastily evacuated. Even partisans are reporting a partial withdrawal of Russians from several positions. It's a rather symbolic picture. Capturing the territory turned out to be much easier than holding it under constant strikes. And while the occupiers on the Crimean spit think about how to evacuate the remnants of their units, Russian logistics problems only multiply. It seems that lately, all roads leading to Crimea have suddenly become a source of a massive headache for the Russian command. Another alarming signal for the occupiers came from the Arabat Spit area, one of the most important routes used to supply the Russian grouping in the south. Crimean social media reports a strike on the bridge between Henichesk and the Arabat Spit, and satellite data cited by the Crimean Wind Monitoring Group recorded fires in areas where Russian troops are stationed. Judging by the reaction of the occupation administration, the situation turned out to be much more serious than they wanted to show. Collaborator Volodymyr Saldo was forced to admit the strike and report the closure of the crossing. Later, the occupation authorities began to reassure the population, stating that traffic would be partially restored, but the bridge needs repair. When even after successful air defense work, a strategic crossing has to be urgently repaired, it already looks like a rather telling result. For the Kremlin, the problem is not just the bridge itself. Every such strike gradually destroys the entire supply system of Russian troops in the south. If before the occupiers could relatively calmly transfer equipment, fuel, and ammunition through numerous routes, now these routes are becoming fewer and fewer. And the more such bottlenecks appear on the map, the closer the prospect that Moscow fears most becomes the transformation of Crimea and adjacent occupied territories into a logistical trap for its own army. However, the most telling thing is not even the attack on the Arabat Spit itself, but Russia's reaction to the threat of Ukrainian strikes. It seems the Kremlin understands perfectly how vulnerable their logistics have become, and therefore they are feverishly trying to protect the most valuable transport facility of the occupied south, the Crimean Bridge. Updated satellite images show a rather telling picture. Around the crossing over the Kerch Strait, the Russians have actually built an entire defense complex. Barges, boom barriers, anti-sabotage structures, additional defensive lines in the water. It seems that the bridge is being prepared not for normal operation but for a siege. And a siege that Moscow is clearly very afraid of. The contrast between the official statements of Russian propaganda and the actual actions of the occupiers looks especially funny. From TV screens, Russians have been told for years that the situation is under full control and all attacks are allegedly successfully repelled. However, if everything is so good, then why turn the main transport artery to Crimea into a floating fortified area surrounded by protection on all sides? In fact, the answer is obvious. The Crimean Bridge remains critically important for the supply of Russian troops on the occupied peninsula, and every new strike on logistics only increases nervousness in the Kremlin. Because when a multi-layered defense system has to be built around one bridge, it indicates not confidence in one's own strength, but an increasing fear of losing the last reliable artery connecting occupied Crimea with the territory of Russia. And while Russian generals are trying to patch holes in logistics around Crimea, unpleasant news for the occupiers is also coming from another direction. On the Donetsk-Mariupol highway, which remains one of the key transport arteries of the Russian grouping, drones of the Spartan Brigade are methodically destroying enemy military transport. Russian equipment catches fire one after another, and with it, the myth of a calm rear, where one can accumulate forces and transfer resources with impunity, burns down. Russian propagandists are increasingly complaining about strikes where they previously felt completely safe. If just a few years ago, occupied Donetsk was presented as a center of a new reality far from the war, now even there Russian military personnel are forced to look into the sky. Ukrainian drones don't just spot the enemy's strategic routes, they also remind the occupiers that the idea of a safe rear is quickly losing its meaning. However, recent Ukrainian strikes haven't just targeted equipment and logistical routes. More and more often, targets are being hit that the Russian army simply can't do without in modern warfare. Control and training centers for drone operators. This was further confirmed by a series of strikes on military targets in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. According to the General Staff, Ukrainian forces hit a drone operator training ground near Debaltsev. This is especially painful for the Russian army, as drones have become one of the few ways they can make up for massive losses in equipment and manpower. But the occupiers' problems didn't end there. Drone control points in the Mirnohorod and Perabudova areas, along with command posts near Pokrovsk, were also hit. In other words, the Ukrainian military is targeting not just the drones, but the operators, their training sites, and the command centers. Ukrainian forces are no longer just carrying out isolated strikes on warehouses or equipment. The entire Russian military machine is now under systemic pressure. Logistics routes, crossings, transport arteries, command posts, drone training centers, and even areas once thought to be safe. As a result, the Russian command must handle dozens of crises at once, securing supplies in Crimea, repairing routes, replacing equipment, and restoring command. And the longer this trend continues, the more obvious the main conclusion becomes. For the occupiers, the issue isn't just individual strikes, but the gradual collapse of their entire war support structure. And an army that loses its logistics, command, and safe rear will eventually lose its ability to hold on to occupied territory. Something went wrong in Minsk. Lukashenko suddenly stopped his threats, and Belarusian officials began talking about peace, neutrality, and not wanting to fight. Just yesterday, they were loyal to the Kremlin, but today they're acting like they have nothing to do with any of it. What scared the Belarusian elite so much? Why did Minsk suddenly go into damage control mode? And what signal made Lukashenko suddenly change his tune? All the details are in the report. In Minsk, they're slamming the panic button as hard as they can. Lukashenko, who for many years acted as the Kremlin's tough and loyal ally, often making bold threats against his neighboring countries, has quite noticeably gone suspiciously quiet lately. After President Zelensky's recent tough talk regarding Belarus's involvement in supporting Russian attacks, the official government in Minsk has, rather abruptly, switched its approach, now suddenly making excuses and trying to present itself as peaceful and non-threatening. This shift in tone from Minsk is striking, especially given their previous aggressive stance. It's particularly interesting how the Belarusian authorities are now insisting they aren't involved in the war. The first sign was a strange story involving a statement by Sergei Lavrov. Belarusian state media unexpectedly cut the loudest part of his quote about how those who try to drag Belarus into the war will pay dearly. Only the convenient phrase remained, stating that Minsk supposedly does not participate in the conflict. It looks as if in Belarusian offices they suddenly decided bellicose rhetoric now might bring more problems than benefits. The second warning sign was Defense Minister Viktor Kremlin. The same official who, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, spoke about the absence of threats to Ukraine from Belarusian territory, is now actively explaining that it makes no sense for Belarus to get involved in the war. Until recently, Minsk loved to demonstrate missiles, exercises, and threatening statements, but now the main message has become, we don't want to fight at all. That's ja, dies und. It seems the rhetoric has changed so sharply that even the propagandists don't always keep up with the new party line. The third signal came from the Secretary of the Security Council of Belarus, Alexander Volfovich. He also suddenly spoke about the need to end the war as quickly as possible and about Minsk's desire to avoid any involvement in the conflict. And here a rather funny contrast arises. Just recently, Lukashenko, with a serious look, demonstrated nuclear ambitions and spoke about the readiness to respond to any challenges. And now official Minsk increasingly resembles a person who was shouting loudly over a fence and then suddenly realized that the gates were left open. The problem for the Belarusian leadership is that statements alone can no longer fix the situation. After all, Ukraine and the West see the reality perfectly well. The Belarusian military-industrial complex works in the interests of the Russian war machine. Part of the logistics is provided through the country's territory, and the infrastructure is used to support Russian operations. Therefore, the current campaign about the unwillingness to fight looks more like an attempt to urgently distance themselves from possible consequences than a real change in policy. And if before Lukashenko could afford to play the role of the Kremlin's loudest ally, now the situation looks different. In Minsk, it seems they understand better and better. The longer the war lasts, the more expensive participation becomes, even in indirect forms of support for Russia. Therefore, the Belarusian authorities today resemble a passenger who for many years sat happily next to the driver, but now suddenly began to nervously ask if it's time to get out of the car. The only question is whether it's too late for Minsk to start thinking about this. And this is where it becomes clear why Minsk suddenly started talking so much about peace and the unwillingness to fight. Volodymyr Zelensky publicly presented Lukashenko with a bill for years of cautious participation in the war on the side of the Kremlin. And it's no longer about political statements or diplomatic vows, but about very specific objects. The president of Ukraine reported on 4 Russian repeaters in the Gomel and Brest regions, which are used to coordinate Russian drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. According to Zelensky, through these systems, the enemy attacked the Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Volyn regions, as well as energy and railway infrastructure facilities. In other words, while Minsk was talking about its neutrality, Russian drones were receiving help from Belarusian territory for more accurate guidance on Ukrainian targets. And now Kyiv is saying it straight. It's time to decide. Zelensky emphasized that the Ukrainian side has repeatedly passed information to Minsk through intelligence and other channels. In simple terms, first there were warnings behind closed doors, then there were signals, and now the public stage has begun. And it was right after this that a real campaign suddenly started in the Belarusian media about non-participation in the war and a reluctance to get involved in the conflict. The president's statement that Lukashenko's repeated excuses no longer interest anyone sounded particularly harsh, because over the years of war, Kyiv has learned to judge actions, not words. And the actions speak quite loudly. Belarusian enterprises are working for the Russian military-industrial complex. Fuel continues to flow to the Russian army, and technical infrastructure is being used for attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine has effectively issued an ultimatum: the relay stations must be dismantled. Moreover, either Belarus can do it itself or Ukraine will solve the problem on its own. The formula sounded as simple as possible. It's either them or us. And judging by the nervous activity of Belarusian officials in recent days, Minsk has understood perfectly well that this time it's no longer about another diplomatic exchange of statements. So it's possible that all this sudden peacefulness from Belarusian officials has a very prosaic explanation. After years of playing the game of "we're not exactly fighting, but we're helping," Lukashenko was directly told for the first time the era of half measures is ending. And now Minsk faces a choice that is becoming increasingly difficult to put off until later. Real panic is starting in Moscow. The capital of the Russian Federation is being urgently covered with air defense systems, as if the front line is already on the outskirts of the city. What was considered completely safe until recently suddenly requires reinforced protection. But the more the authorities try to hide the problems, the more obvious they become. What scared the Kremlin so much, and why did Moscow suddenly start preparing for the worst-case scenario? Watch the report. The war that the Kremlin planned to wage far from its own borders is increasingly knocking right on the door of the Russian capital. After a series of strikes on the Moscow oil refinery, the Russian military deployed real forests of air defense systems around the facility. At the highest points near the plant, Panzer systems appeared one after another, as if it were not a rear facility in the center of the country, but a frontline zone. It is particularly telling that to protect the Moscow refinery, the Russians had to urgently transfer anti-aircraft systems from other directions. And here's the most interesting part, because every new Panzer placed to guard the capital's oil tanks automatically stops covering some other military facility, warehouse, airfield, or industrial enterprise. It turns into a classic Russian dilemma. If you plug the holes around Moscow, they become even larger somewhere else.
So what does this mean? First of all, as we can see, air defense isn't helping Moscow. And secondly, other strategic facilities, including refineries and ports, will be left bare, without protection or cover.
Overall, the picture for the Kremlin is looking increasingly alarming. What was recently presented as a symbol of absolute security and control is gradually turning into a fortress under siege. The Russian authorities continue to talk about successfully repelled attacks, but at the same time, air defense systems are being deployed in several layers around strategic sites. And when the capital of the world's largest country starts feverishly covering its own oil refinery, it shows not confidence in its strength, but a growing fear that the next strike could be even more painful. While new air defense batteries are being feverishly deployed near strategic sites, officials are increasingly choosing a different tactic for protecting the population, simply not informing them of the danger. The logic is simple and brilliant in its own way. If you don't turn on the siren, then maybe the problem will just go away on its own. The situation during one of the largest drone attacks on Moscow and the region was particularly telling. Many residents said they woke up not from an alarm or a threat notification, but from explosions outside their windows. The sirens were silent. There were no SMS warnings, even though the authorities had previously spent hundreds of millions of rubles on the alert system. It seems the main purpose of this system is not to warn of danger, but to look good in budget reports about its existence.
There was no air raid alert in Moscow, no SMS warnings about the attack, residents of the south of the capital said. They woke up from explosions, not sirens. Just in case, they took the children to the bathroom away from the windows. They are scared, they were crying, says a Moscow woman who lives about 3 kilometers from the attacked oil refinery. At the same time, in 2023 and 2024, the city authorities spent 171 million rubles on the emergency alert system. During previous raids, it wasn't turned on either.
The explanations from Russian officials look even more interesting. In different regions, the refusal to sound alarms is justified in different ways. In some places, they fear panic. In others, they talk about the population getting used to it. And in some, they've decided that drones are not a serious enough reason for civil defense. It's a paradoxical situation. Drones regularly attack targets in the Russian rear, but the authorities try to convince citizens there's nothing to worry about. The situation in the Moscow region itself looks most symbolic. Their local authorities in some places aren't even in a hurry to reveal the addresses of shelters and bunkers, citing a desire not to cause panic. In effect, Russians are being offered a rather unusual security model. Don't report the threat, don't talk about shelters, and if something happens, deal with it after the explosions. And the longer the war lasts, the more this whole system starts to resemble not civil defense, but an attempt at any cost to hide from the population the scale of the problems that are getting closer and closer to Russia itself.
Essentially, all these explanations boil down to one common denominator. The scale of strikes on Russian territory is already so large that the silence of the sirens has ceased to be a matter of logistics. Now it's a matter of political survival for the regime, which for years built an image of a war that supposedly doesn't affect the average Russian.
Meanwhile, the good old fuel crisis in Russia isn't about to retreat either. While the Kremlin keeps talking about economic resilience and victories over sanctions, reality looks more and more like emergency survival mode. After strikes on oil refineries, logistics problems, and price hikes, fuel shortages are reaching even those places where it was recently seen as a guaranteed resource. The situation in Russian light aviation has become particularly telling. Due to rising costs and shortages of aviation gasoline, some operators have already begun experimenting with fueling planes with regular car fuel. It sounds as if a country dreaming of new supersonic missiles and space breakthroughs suddenly decided to check if it can fly on what's left after fueling the family sedan. Moreover, Russian market participants themselves are openly warning about the risks. Using lower quality fuel can lead to engine problems, loss of thrust, and other unpleasant surprises in the air, but the choices are becoming increasingly limited. In some regions, fuel tankers have already stopped filling planes with extra fuel reserves, leaving only the minimum amount necessary for the flight. In other words, the safety margin is gradually disappearing even where it was always considered mandatory. An equally alarming signal is that Russia is already seriously talking about state regulation of aviation fuel prices. And here a paradox familiar to the Russian economy arises. When officials start fighting shortages with administrative methods, the shortage often gets even worse. Even Russian experts themselves warn, you can set a nice low price on paper, but that won't make more fuel available. All of this adds up to a rather unpleasant picture for the Kremlin. While additional air defense systems are being pulled into Moscow and the authorities are afraid to turn on sirens during attacks, the fuel problem continues to slowly undermine the economy from within. And if until recently the consequences of the war were measured mainly by explosions at refineries and rising prices at gas stations, now they are increasingly reaching even aircraft. And this already looks like another symptom that the war is becoming much more expensive for Russia than the Kremlin expected at the very beginning. Putin's empire is drowning in catastrophes. How much longer it will stay afloat is a matter of time. The Kremlin is sounding the alarm. The West is launching a new wave of powerful weapons for Ukraine, and what recently seemed like a distant scenario to Moscow is rapidly becoming a reality. The balance of power could change much faster than expected in the Russian Federation. Every new statement from partners causes more and more nerves in the Kremlin. What is Moscow so afraid of, and how can new weapons affect the course of the war? All the details are in the report. What the Kremlin has feared in recent years could become a reality. The West is not only not reducing military support for Ukraine, but is also starting to launch a new generation of long-range missiles into production. And if the plans of defense companies are realized, the count could go into the hundreds and even thousands of high-precision weapons for the Ukrainian army. The first wake-up call for Moscow was the news from the Netherlands. They announced funding for the production of 700 long-range cruise missiles from the company Destina specifically for Ukraine. And this is just one program. At the same time, reports continue to circulate about Ukraine's use of new long-range ERAM missiles with a claimed range of over 930 kilometers. But that's not even the most interesting part. According to some estimates, future deliveries may no longer be in single batches, but on a scale that will be counted in the thousands. For the Russian military command, such a prospect looks almost like a strategic nightmare. Because while before they could try to hide warehouses, headquarters, and military plants far in the rear, now the very concept of safe depth is starting to crumble. From Belgorod to the Urals, from military airfields to defense industry enterprises, all of this is gradually falling into the zone of potential risk. But the real intrigue is unfolding in Great Britain. Defense giant MBDA reported successful tests of the new crossbow missile drone. And here, what's especially painful for the Kremlin isn't even the range of 800 kilometers or the 300-kilogram warhead. The speed of development is impressive. Only 9 months passed from the emergence of the idea to a finished prototype. In fact, the British demonstrated that modern high-precision weapons can now be created faster than Russian officials can write another report about having no analogs. And crossbow is just one part of a much larger story. As part of the British Breakstop project, several more long-range systems are being created in parallel. For example, Tiger Shark is capable of hitting targets at a distance of up to 1,000 kilometers, carrying a 300-kilogram warhead, and its cost is just over $500,000, which by modern military standards looks like a budget option. Even more interesting is Skylens, with a claimed range of up to 1,200 kilometers. One detail adds a particular piquancy to the situation. All these systems are created according to the ITAR-free principle. In simple terms, without American components that could restrict the transfer of weapons to third countries. That is, the British deliberately designed these missiles so that in the future they could be transferred to Ukraine quickly and without unnecessary bureaucracy. For the Kremlin, this is a very unpleasant signal. There are fewer and fewer political levers to block such deliveries. What looks most symbolic is how the West's very approach has changed. If at the beginning of the full-scale war, allies argued even about the transfer of individual artillery systems, now it's increasingly about joint production, multi-year funding programs, and the creation of entire lines of long-range weapons specifically for Ukraine's needs. In fact, a new defense ecosystem is being formed in which Ukraine is no longer just a recipient of aid, but one of the key centers of future European security. It's funny that Putin started this war under slogans about the demilitarization of Ukraine. A few years have passed, and now Ukraine is gaining access to technologies it could only dream of before. The West is launching new production lines, financing hundreds and thousands of long-range systems. If these programs are implemented even partially, the coming years may turn out to be much less peaceful for many Russian facilities than the Kremlin is used to expecting. For Russians, night alerts are becoming as much a part of life as their morning coffee. Before Moscow could recover from previous attacks, the sky over Russia and the occupied territories was again filled with the sounds of explosions and sirens. It all looked most symbolic right in the Russian capital. While officials reported on more successful interceptions over the Moscow region, drones flew by one after another. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin spent the night counting new targets approaching the city practically in real time. According to him, nearly 60 drones were allegedly shot down on the outskirts of Moscow. The irony is that the more such reports appear, the harder it is for Russians to believe the fairy tales about the capital's absolute safety. Powerful explosions were also heard in Bryansk. Holy shit! Nice! According to local sources, railway infrastructure was hit, one of the key arteries through which Russian military logistics are supplied. For the Kremlin, this is a particularly painful topic because while generals dream of new offensives, more and more rear facilities are forced to think not about transporting cargo, but about their own survival. It was no less heated in occupied Crimea. Explosions were heard there in several districts of the peninsula at once. Particular attention was drawn to the Tavriiska thermal power plant near Simferopol, one of the key energy facilities that Russia once built as a symbol of the final integration of occupied Crimea into its own system. Now, this symbol is increasingly appearing in the news due to damage, fires, and the consequences of attacks. After previous strikes, burnt structures, holes, and serious destruction had already been recorded there. Events in Armyansk unfolded even more interestingly. According to preliminary information, the strike hit the FSB border service building near the railway station. A fire started after the explosion, and witnesses reported further detonations. When security forces' facilities start exploding, even the most staunch supporters of Kremlin TV shows suddenly begin to ask very uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of the entire defense system. Reports of explosions also came from Donetsk and Berdyansk. In the latter, the railway station area drew particular attention, where a fire broke out after the attack. And this once again demonstrates one simple trend. The geography of strikes is constantly expanding, and the list of facilities that the Russian authorities considered relatively safe is rapidly shrinking. The final statistics from the Russian Ministry of Defense look particularly telling. They claimed that 301 Ukrainian drones were allegedly shot down in a single night. And here, a rather awkward paradox arises. If the threat is indeed so massive that they have to report on hundreds of targets over dozens of regions, then Russia itself is effectively admitting that the air war has long since moved far beyond the front lines. While Kremlin officials continue to talk about being in control, Russian regions are increasingly waking up not to alarm clocks, but to explosions. And it seems that for many residents of Russia, this is becoming a new, very unpleasant reality. Putin is losing even what has been his main weapon for years. The image of the all-powerful master of the Kremlin is rapidly falling apart, and warning signs for Moscow are coming one after another. Zelensky made bold statements about Putin's fears and the trap he has driven himself into. Meanwhile, the West is preparing new billions for Ukraine, and among former Kremlin sympathizers, more and more are starting to see the light. Who is turning away from Moscow, and why are there more and more reasons for panic in the Kremlin? Watch our report. Putin is rapidly losing power, and it's already noticeable even to his allies. What seemed impossible just a few years ago is now being heard more and more often at the highest level. The master of the Kremlin is weakening not only on the front, where the Russian army pays a huge price for every kilometer, but also politically, where his ability to dictate his will to the world is melting away before our eyes. Even his long-standing strategy of intimidation no longer has its former effect. Volodymyr Zelensky stated directly that Putin is weakening politically, militarily, and physically. And this is especially symbolic, as the entire Putin system has been built for decades on the image of an all-powerful leader who supposedly controls everything. But today, the reality looks completely different. Russia is bogged down in an exhausting war. The economy is forced to operate in a mode of constant survival under sanctions, and more resources are spent not on the country's development but on ways to maintain the regime's shaky structure. Even more telling is the reaction of the West. While the Kremlin previously hoped to tire out Ukraine's allies and force them to cut support, the opposite is now happening. After another Ramstein meeting, Ukraine received confirmation of large-scale funding for Patriot missiles worth over $1 billion, while Europe prepares new sanction blows. It's quite an ironic picture. The more Putin tries to demonstrate strength, the more nations unite against him. Especially painful for the Kremlin is that fewer and fewer people believe his stories about peaceful intentions. The world sees not a confident strategist in control, but a politician trapped by his own decisions. The war that was supposed to bring a quick victory and a new superpower status has turned into an endless burden, draining Russia's resources, reputation, and future. And here lies the main paradox. The weaker Putin becomes, the more desperately he tries to prove the opposite. But history knows many examples where the loudest claims of strength were made at the very moment when imperial structures were already starting to fall apart. And today, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin regime is entering exactly such a period. Not a period of triumph, but a period of exhaustion, nervousness, and loss of control over events that until recently seemed completely manageable to him. Putin is not afraid of NATO, not of sanctions, and not even of negotiations. He is afraid of his own army. Volodymyr Zelensky's statement sounded like a verdict on all Kremlin propaganda about a confident leader who supposedly controls the situation. In fact, if we believe the words of the president of Ukraine, the master of the Kremlin is trapped in a war that he himself started. Because the end of hostilities may bring him not relief, but new problems.
Putin doesn't want to stop, and all his talk about wanting peace is all a lie.
And the longer the war lasts, the more obvious this reality becomes. For years, the Kremlin tried to convince the world it was ready for dialogue, but every time, beautiful words were followed by new strikes, ultimatums, and demands. It seems peace is more dangerous for Putin than war, because peace means having to answer uncomfortable questions about the cost of this adventure.
Undoubtedly, Putin is afraid of his army returning home, which is why he's so afraid of the war ending without negotiations.
And this sounds like a real nightmare for any authoritarian regime. Hundreds of thousands of people have gone through the front, seen the reality of war, and will return to a country where the promised triumph never happened. For the Kremlin, this isn't just demobilization, it's a potential explosion of social discontent that cannot be hidden behind TV shows and loud speeches. A man who for decades built an image of a fearless and all-powerful ruler today increasingly resembles a leader who fears the consequences of his own decisions. He's afraid to end the war, afraid of the military returning, afraid of losing control of the situation. Against this backdrop, Zelensky once again emphasized Ukraine is ready for negotiations, but Europe must act tougher, strengthen sanctions, confiscate Russian assets, and increase support for Kyiv. Because without real security guarantees, the Kremlin might try to return to its imperial plans. And while Putin dreams of restoring influence to the level of the Soviet Union, reality is turning out quite differently. Ukraine has already become one of the most powerful armies in the Euro-Atlantic space, while the Kremlin ruler himself increasingly looks not like the architect of a new order, but a hostage of his own war. They are turning away from Putin in the United States as well. What the Kremlin feared most has worked. People have begun to see reality with their own eyes. One of the most influential figures in the MAGA world, Laura Loomer, unexpectedly admitted that she had been under the influence of Russian propaganda for years. The blogger, who has direct access to Donald Trump and influences millions of conservative voters, effectively stated, the Kremlin masterfully manipulated the American right, forcing them to look at Russia through rose-colored glasses. Her revelations sound especially painful for Moscow, as this is not about some random social media commentator, but a person from Trump's closest political circle. Loomer openly admitted that for a long time she repeated anti-Ukrainian talking points, not realizing how much the Russian information machine influenced her perception. And now she speaks about Russian missile strikes on civilians and the lies surrounding the mythical denazification. The irony is that the Kremlin itself helped accelerate this realization. When some American conservatives began to openly admire Russia and participate in Putin's forums, the masks began to fall off. At the same time, podcast editor Loomer visited Ukraine during massive attacks, saw the consequences of the shelling with his own eyes, spoke with people, and returned to the United States with a radically different vision of what is actually happening. For the Kremlin, this is a particularly unpleasant signal because for years, Russian propaganda has tried to convince Americans that Ukraine is the problem and Russia is an ally. Now, even within the MAGA environment, an uncomfortable question is being asked more and more often. If Russia is so traditional and Christian, then why does it launch missiles at residential buildings every night and try to erase an entire country from the map? The fact that one of the most influential figures suddenly began to destroy Russian myths in front of an audience of millions looks quite symbolic. Especially now, when Europe is strengthening its support for Ukraine, military aid is increasing and sanctions pressure is only growing. It seems that the circle of people who are ready to unconditionally believe the Kremlin's fairy tales is becoming narrower and narrower. And this is another very bad piece of news for Putin, who has recently been losing allies much faster than he has been finding new ones. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, give us a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episode.